So it's a wonderful opportunity to be here this morning with Mark Oppenheimer. Mark is, as I'm sure many people will be aware, a highly respected and very brilliant advocate who has been involved in multiple cases, particularly involving freedom of expression. And he has given us his very valuable time today to talk about these things. And specifically, we're going to be asking him his views on freedom of expression, how it relates to freedom of religion. And we're in for a very interesting conversation. So, Mark, welcome and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Maybe we can just start off with the first question, which is basically, what is, in your view, the sort of ambit, the importance, the historical significance of freedom of expression? And perhaps on the back of that, what do you think are the major threats that we face to this, what has, I think, hitherto been seen as a fundamental, if not foundational, human right?
Yeah, so I think it's worth thinking about what South Africa looked like before we had a constitution, which is that we lived in a society which had very little consideration for freedom of expression. We had a state that had very strong censorship. I think people will today find it strange that certain records would have scratch marks on them to ban certain songs. Books like Black Beauty were banned. A huge list of pieces of information were just inaccessible to ordinary South Africans. And this was done under the guise of saying, we need to protect you from these sinister ideas. And as your state, we're going to act like a paterfamilias, a responsible parent, and we're going to protect you. And so there's always some kind of noble guise in which ideas are banned. We must remember that certain symbols were banned during apartheid. The ANC flag was banned. And people were jailed for having those sorts of emblems. There's a case of someone who had it on their coffee mug and they were jailed. So we come from this dark history of censorship, and this is recognized in our constitution, this idea that we must have a break from the oppressive past, and we must recognize these important universal human rights like freedom of expression. And one of the wonderful things about our constitution is that it's modern. So the American Constitution, there are constant fights about what the words mean because you're dealing with a 200-year-old document. Our Constitution is very crisp and clear. It grants enormous room for freedom of expression and then doesn't limit it to these categories, but specifically entrenches them. So freedom of the press, freedom of artistic creativity. So that's not just the final artwork or the final novel. It's the process of creating the artwork. Academic research, all sorts of things that are quite important to protect. Why are they important? Well, one of the ways to find out what's actually true is allowing people to express their ideas. And some of the ideas that people express will be false. And it's through this clash that we find out what's true.
I remember you saying that it's also important for moral agency as well. So not just in the search for truth, but also for people to be able to make political decisions and so forth.
Yes, undoubtedly the case. So this notion that people are children and that they should be protected from certain ideas undermines their agency. It's the notion that you can't be trusted, your choices don't matter. And so if you think that agency matters, that dignity matters, that autonomy matters, free speech is intrinsically linked to this. And it also means letting people make bad decisions. Not all the speech that people are going to utter is going to be speech that we would like. You don't need to protect people's right to say that the sky is blue and they like unicorns. That's inoffensive speech. It's the stuff that challenges. It's the stuff that makes people go, I'm quite uncomfortable with this idea. And if you think about how society has progressed over time, a lot of it was about saying things that made people uncomfortable. So during apartheid, if you said, I think that a black person and a white person ought to be allowed to get married and ought to be able to live in the same place, this would have been seen as a repugnant idea that most people would have found offensive during apartheid, and it's the kind of thing that would have been censored. But now we have widespread interracial marriage. Similarly, the campaigns for the recognition of gay marriage happened because of people exercising their free speech rights, being able to lobby forth these ideas that at one time were seen as incomprehensible. The notion that two men could marry each other was seen as incomprehensible. and if comprehensible, definitely immoral. And now you have South Africa being the 5th nation in the world to recognize the right to gay marriage, and a leader in that front. It's also important because if you think about the connection between free speech and religion, this notion of tolerance really comes out of the 100 Years' War in Europe, of Protestants and Catholics killing each other because they disagreed about what God wants, and this idea that, well, maybe we should allow each other to speak. Maybe I should hear you out. That you should be free to swing your fist to the edge of my nose and no further. That you can use your words instead of your swords. This kind of classically liberal idea, just fundamentally important for being able to protect people's religious rights as well. And it's why you have now Protestants and Catholics living quite peacefully amongst each other.
I think perhaps one of the things that is little emphasized or perhaps appreciated is the cost that was paid for this right to freedom of expression. Literally oceans of human blood over hundreds of years of bloody warfare was fought for it. And yet today, and this would be another perhaps segue question for you, today it seems, number one, this right is not perhaps properly appreciated, and number two, that it is in danger of being eroded. Can you perhaps highlight some of the ways that you have seen this happening from your side of the fence, and also what we should be looking out for in the future?
Yes, so there have been a number of pieces of legislation that aim to erode free speech rights. I'd say one of the more dangerous ones that emerged was the Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Bill. It's an interesting piece of legislation. It emerges at a political time in South Africa where President Zuma was under enormous amounts of threat. You had public demonstrations calling for him to fall. This is towards the end of 2015. He'd fired a finance minister, the Rand had tanked. And then on the 4th of January, the big news story is about a hitherto little known estate agent in the middle of nowhere called Penny Sparrow. And this story just sends shockwaves around media, and this idea that we need to stop racist speech becomes the paramount issue and really captures the attention of the public and the press. Since then, that's in 2016, and the press initially said, "This is an amazing thing. Thank you so much. Thank you for protecting us, Daddy." And then they start to realize, hold on a second, this might lead to some of us being jailed.
So much for freedom of the press.
Yes, so much for freedom of the press. And the press really, are quite happy to cheer along terrible ideas until they realize it'll have, personal repercussions for them. And so in 2016, the forces of justice get together, and many submissions are written, and the bill is defeated, and it disappears. It then reemerges a couple of years later, and I will say that the submissions really did a lot of good work. Particularly the submissions about protecting religious freedoms. You start to see special protections, you start to see the language changing. It's definitely better than the totalitarian fascist legislation we saw emerging first. It's still got problems, and it's still unconstitutional. So to give you an idea of why, maybe it's worth setting out what the Constitution says about speech that's not protected. So we have a limitations clause inside the Constitution that says free speech doesn't extend to the following things. So they're not prohibited by the Constitution. It just tells you that in your apple of free speech rights, a bite has been taken out. The first is propaganda for war. The second is the incitement of imminent violence. And the third is advocacy of hatred on one of 4 grounds: race, gender, ethnicity, and religion, and that constitutes an incitement to cause harm. Now, just to unpack that a little bit, what we are dealing with are catastrophic calls for violence. If you think about propaganda for war, you're encouraging a nation to go and kill another nation. Seems like something worth guarding against.
Genocide. That's what one thinks of when you read propaganda for war or incitement of imminent violence. You're thinking of the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda, and you're thinking that level of public violence occurring and inciting people and inciting to cause harm, both of those elements also. So, yes.
That's exactly right. So the point is that you are calling on people to perform a harm against another group. And the Constitution limits it to those 4 groups. And there's a couple of arguments for why those 4 groups are selected. Bear in mind that the Equality Clause, Section 9 of the Constitution, lists many more groups. So it's not that the founders were unaware of these groups. They made a deliberate choice to say these are the groups that get special protection. And the idea is that people have been persecuted on the grounds of their religion or on the grounds of their race or their ethnic affiliation. And these are reasons to have heightened protections. So instead of saying it's violence or the imminency factor, we can dilute those down to harm. But harm mustn't be read as things that are merely hurtful or offensive, and the Constitutional Court in Kwalani makes this quite clear. So that gives you an idea of the parameters. There are further limitations that could take place because we have Section 36 as general limitations. And so there might be reasons, for example, to include additional groups. The court in Kwalani, for example, took the view that sexual orientation, there's enough evidence to say this is a group that has been subject to acts of strong discrimination over time. That bear in mind that not just that gay marriage is very new in South Africa, but that sodomy was illegal up until 1993. So you have a group that's been persecuted. There are people who've been beheaded on the grounds of their sexual orientation. So there's some reason to protect the group. It's not clear that all the other grounds necessarily require the same level of protection. And one of the arguments is that that should be determined by the legislature, that they should have a fact-finding exercise to determine who really is vulnerable. But what we see that's a problem in the new hate speech bill is there's an or that's snuck in. So if we think about what the Constitution says, there must be the advocacy of hatred and the incitement to harm. Here what we have is an or. So suddenly merely, I think there's a distinction between hateful speech and genuine hate speech. Hateful speech might be that which is offensive or expresses hate towards a group, but doesn't call for any action against them. And this legislation will prohibit it. One of the reasons to be further concerned is that it's unlike the Equality Act, which only imposes civil sanctions. This has criminal sanctions, so you can be sent to jail. The other thing that's worrying about it as well is that there's this room for prosecutorial discretion. So if you think back over the last couple of years about who tends to get prosecuted for hate speech under the Equality Act, it's certain groups. It's people that are viewed as enemies of the state, that hold the wrong political views, or that are unpopular, or that'll be useful pawns in another game. So there's a danger that it'll be used for that purpose.
Mark, so with, your knowledge about the history of freedom of expression, we spoke about it now, South Africa coming out of a country that didn't have freedom of expression. So what are your thoughts that actually, in a democratic state, we might be jailing people for publicly voicing opinions? And even perhaps, I know you're involved in some cases where even private expression is seen as hate speech under the current Equality Act. So what are your thoughts about this trajectory of the South African state, not even half a century into democracy, already moving back towards totalitarianism, thought control, controlling certain forms of expression, and really not just threatening with, you might need to tender an apology because society views your speech as being so offensive, but hey, you might actually go to jail for 3 years for a first offense and 10 years for a second offense.
Yes, there's something quite troubling about those that were viewed as liberators, that were trying to grant people their human rights through this internationally lauded constitution, turn around and take those rights away from people. And I think if you remember the words of Lord Acton, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, this is a good explanation for why we see this, that the ANC has been in power since 1994, that they believe they will govern until Jesus comes back. And when you hold that belief, you think, well, what are you going to do about it? I'm going to take away your free speech rights. I'm going to discriminate against you. What are you going to do about it? And luckily, we still have some levers to do something about it, which is that there are wonderful NGOs who are willing to fight the good fight, to push back against state tyranny, that we still have some incredible judges and jurists in the country who are willing to use the Constitution to push back against some of those executive abuses or legislative abuses. So I think there's some comfort in that. But I do think one should never become too comfortable. Ronald Reagan said that you don't win freedom, that the cost of freedom is eternal vigilance, and we must always be vigilant.
Mark, what's your view? I mean, we've talked about the potential for free speech, or rather hate speech or similar repressive measures against free speech to be used by political actors. But what are your views on how the same type of legislation can be used by just general activists? Because obviously the sphere that we 4SA are in is that most religion is typically conservative in nature and holds conservative traditional viewpoints, for want of a better word. And we tend to see that with the way that the world is moving, shifting, it's much more secular, it's much more liberal, that these very same pieces of legislation, and I'm not necessarily just thinking here in South Africa, I'm thinking about how this has developed and perhaps even accelerated in other, so-called Western world contexts. How do you see this sort of shaping up in South Africa, number one? What is the things that we should be on the lookout for? And what is your view, generally speaking, on that type of use of anti-hate speech legislation, whether it's civil or even criminal, in the sort of civil activist areas?
Yeah, so like where it's not just vertical with the state down, state power being forced down, but actually horizontal with, fellow humans using the state's power to make sure you don't say anything that offends them, which actually links back to that bit about what you said about the bill having a disjunctive, an or reading, as opposed to a conjunctive reading, the way the Constitution has, and the way the Concord said in Kwelani, where you have to have an and. Because the hate speech bill's definition of harm as well, which features in the hate speech definition itself, is much wider than what the Concord says, and which brings us back to what Michael has now said about actually, if you say something in terms of that bill that causes any form of psychological harm or emotional harm to someone. So Michael says something.
One of the things that's vitally important is not just that we have the right to free speech, but that we have a culture of free speech. Exactly. And part of that means recognizing that people are going to say things that we're not going to like, that we're going to disagree with each other, and that's okay, that it's okay to feel offended. The nature of emotional distress is that it fades away. One can feel a sense of shock or fear or anger, and that's okay. That's part of the human experience. We're not talking about, deep psychological trauma. Once you move into that territory, once you have, speech that can cause post-traumatic stress syndrome, that's the kind of speech that the Constitutional Court says, well, we should be wary about this speech. But that's a very, very high bar, and it's a very rare thing. It's not just, I don't like what you've said. And part of that is because the best remedy for bad speech is more speech. That if we don't like someone's views, we can articulate a different view. We can persuade people to say, well, I think you're wrong for these reasons, and here's why. And that's how we have intellectual progress in a society, or social progress. So that's an important thing to recognize. You mentioned that there is something unique about South Africa's hate speech framework, which is that it's not just about a vertical relationship with the state, that the Equality Act allows people to claim against each other. So there's a sort of horizontal relationship. Now, I do think there is some space for hate speech regulation. I'm not a free speech absolutist, and I think that if you stick to the constitutional bounds, there are certain kinds of speech that are very dangerous. So I think when you have people calling for the slaughter of a minority racial group in a country, that's speech worth combating. And often it'll be the case that the state is willing to tolerate speech that's really intolerable, and it requires private actors to play a role to hold those bad actors to account. And so I think that's important. But we want to make sure that the norms that are in place actually match our Constitution. And the difficulty with the term hate speech is that it sort of can mean whatever speech I don't like. And that's the danger. And that's how it's used colloquially. If you look at, the sort of developments in the case law since Penny Sparrow, Penny Sparrow's case is widely described as hate speech. I think it's quite fair to call it racist speech or repugnant speech or offensive speech. The later cases basically acknowledged that it doesn't amount to hate speech. It was described as hurtful speech, and the interpretation of the act was hurtful speech is hate speech, and that has now been decisively removed by the Constitutional Court. So
it's interesting, because just tagging onto what you said there about hurtful speech not being hate speech, which is what the court said in Kwelani, which was your matter, if I'm correct. It's interesting because I mean, before COVID, when everything went virtual for the last 2 years, there was a lot of talk about safe spaces in university and about how speech that offends triggers and so forth, and how you're not allowed to say certain things on university campuses, which historically have been the the epicenter of freedom and freedom of thought and academic freedom. And all of a sudden you see this almost like self-censorship now happening because of the language being like, okay, if you microaggress me by using trigger words around me, and those could change depending on whatever the political flavor of the moment is, then I'm allowed to use macro-actual physical aggressions against you. And we saw a lot of protests on university campuses about this and so forth. So, I mean, you see people self-censoring because of the fudgy definition of hate speech.
Yes. So the concern is that we are not imbibing a culture of free speech, that we're imbibing a culture of, as you say, safe spaces. And the danger with that is that, first of all, everybody says, well, I must be protected. Treat me like a child, treat me like I'm 5 years old, and that there's certain words you just don't say around me, certain ideas that are too dangerous for me to think about. And, just give me hugs and cuddles and, make a playpen at your university for me, because, this isn't a place where I should be challenged. This is a place where I should be mollycoddled. And there's a huge danger in that, which is that when those kids aren't mollycoddled, when they hear something they don't like, they act out with real violence, that they've used this sort of strange way of redefining things to say that certain words are violence or that silence is violence. And in retaliation, we can burn your building down. And we've seen this in South Africa during the Fees Must Fall movement. We had the science faculty being burnt down at Northwest University. We had art collections being burnt. We had, this is sort of interesting relationship between South Africa and the States, is that our removal of various statues was recognized by the Americans, and they followed suit, and they removed statues of Abraham Lincoln on the grounds they found it offensive. Someone who's really regarded as the champion of ending slavery in America. So once you start to go down this line of anything that's possibly offensive should be removed, you will wind up with nothing left to see, read, or enjoy. There's a wonderful novel called Fahrenheit 451. That's the temperature at which paper burns. And it opens with a group of firemen who are torching a library. And the idea is that the firemen in this world don't extinguish fires, they start them. And your immediate assumption is, this must be done by a totalitarian state. This is like a 1984. And only halfway through do you realize why. And it starts with this. Someone says, look, there are all these minority groups in our society, and there's just this one word in this book that I find really offensive. Can't you just take that one word out? People say, of course, it's hurtful, it's painful, it's not really much of a cost for us to take out the one word, no problem. And they say, but there's this sentence and this page and this book and this library. And so that slippery slope is real. Once you start to say that your principle for banning speech is how to make other people feel, you've got to recognize that people have a wide variety of different emotional reactions to content, and that free speech is one of those things that is hard to find. That societies didn't have it for a very long time. They like to control their citizens. They don't want people to see things that they view as offensive. And so it's a right that must be constantly protected. In some senses, it's not surprising that people push back against free speech, because there's something unnatural about it. It's about saying, I'm going to give you some measure of autonomy, that you're going to be able to say things that upset other people. But we recognize throughout human history that that's a very good way to make progress, even if it has these prickly bits along the way.
Yeah, just another thing I want to touch base with you on is, when we're talking about free speech, obviously there's the measure to which we ought to be allowed to express it. And then there are the sanctions that are not necessarily official sanctions for those who do not abide by, let's say, the prevailing code of free speech that we're all supposed to be following, the politically correct code specifically, and the cancel culture that results from that, the book banning that results from that. And I think specifically, I'd like to get your views on where you think that is going to end up.
Yeah, just before you chime in, when you were talking about Fahrenheit 9/11 and Michael started speaking about the book banning, I immediately thought about the book burnings in Nazi Germany. And I mean, this is the slippery slope one goes down when you start saying, okay, actually, we're not going to tolerate, we're not going to allow room for, we're not going to allow freedom for offensive and hurtful speech. Of course, as we've already said, you know, not free speech in its absolute form, propaganda for war, incitement of imminent violence, and true hate speech. But yes.
Yes, I mean, people look at those images of Nazis Zig Heiling and burning books and they think, what kind of a society would do this? We would never do this. And then you start to see the direction that we move in. You know, I remember I studied at the University of Cape Town, and seeing students grab art off the walls, put it into a pyre and set it alight on the grounds that they found it offensive, immediately brought that back to my mind. I've been to Berlin, to the spot where books were burnt. And what's amazing about modern Germany is that they have a never forget line. So there's a memorial there where they've made an empty bookcase underneath the space that you can look down on. You can see, you know, this is the vast library of books that are destroyed. And then across the road at Humboldt University, they sell the books that were banned and that were burned. And that's important. That's one way of fighting back. There's the National Library Association in America has a banned books day, and they celebrate those books that are challenged. And they say, here are the books that people don't want you to read. And it's astonishing what goes on that list. Books that were once celebrated, like To Kill a Mockingbird, are now regularly challenged. I have a friend who taught at a very prominent private school in South Africa, who was pushed out of her employment for teaching To Kill a Mockingbird. So, I mean, the other infamous one that was retracted, not by the state, but by the publisher itself, are some of Dr. Seuss's books, the beloved children's author. And this is why it's worth pointing out, it's not just governments that will take away our speech rights, it's each other. That if we have this culture of fear, this climate where we say we must not offend anybody, we will censor each other into oblivion, and that's very dangerous. And it's something that John Stuart Mill warned against, this idea that we must be worried about the tyranny of the majority, that there are going to be certain ideas that are minority ideas that may be true but are unpopular, and people will try and silence them, and they'll use social pressure, and that can be its own kind of evil and must be resisted.
It's interesting, just maybe a final question, because we are heading towards the end of our time contract. I wanted to ask you, you know, specifically, where is this going, the slippery slope? One of the things that I'm sure you will be well aware of is the C-16 law in Canada, and the remarkable imposition of what seems to amount effectively to forced speech coming in. In other words, we're not necessarily trying to stop you from saying things that might hurt or offend, but you will now actually have to say things that you might feel are fundamentally contrary to everything that you believe in. Just give us your take on that debate, and where to from here. What's the likelihood of that ever coming to South Africa?
Yes, it's an interesting thing. I mean, this stems from, I suppose, a trans rights movement. In the States and in the UK, this is the landmine that you don't want to step on. It is something that will end your career. So you have someone like Kathleen Stock, who wrote a book called Material Girls, which examines the gender narrative and tries to take a very cold philosophical lens to this question. It's an interesting question as to, is there a difference between sex and gender? Could you have multiple genders? What's going on here? She is a lesbian woman. Her wife was pregnant at the time that she was basically frog marked off her campus, that students threatened her life, that the police said, we can't guarantee your safety. So, you know, there's a sense in which this hasn't landed on South Africa's shores yet. But it is such a strongly felt issue. And that because people have this strong feeling of, you know, we need to be accommodating, and there's something in that. There's something about saying we should try and accommodate people as far as we can, that people can then overcorrect. You know, I think that there are trans individuals in South Africa who probably have had their rights trampled on, and it's important to try and protect them. But when you compel speech, you go down a dangerous path. If you think about the kinds of speech that people were compelled to do, there's a long history of making people forcibly convert or take oaths that are fundamentally at odds with their internal beliefs. And so we also, in addition to our free speech rights in South Africa, have rights of freedom of religion and freedom of belief. And so when you force someone to utter words that are unconscionable to them, there is a danger in it. And I think what we want to try and do is come up with reasonable accommodations, that you don't want to force people to do things. You want to try and respect other people's sensibilities. And there are often going to be ways of achieving both of those things. And we should generally be suspicious of any law which compels people to do things. When you're starting to use force, we should be suspicious. That's when the vigilance levels must kick up. I think we are going to be in for those kinds of laws in South Africa. We're seeing it abroad. South Africa is both a follower and a leader in this front. Unfortunately, we follow bad ideas and perpetuate bad ideas.
It's interesting because one would think that as a democracy, especially such a diverse democracy in terms of race, in terms of faith, we've got one of the most diverse societies in the world. One would think that we would celebrate and inculcate tolerance into our children and into our society. So apart from the fact where you can actually, you're inciting someone to commit physical harm to someone, we would tolerate speech given our history of thought control. But it seems that we keep on moving back towards almost this paternalistic state of like, my citizens are too dumb to make their own life choices. I can't trust them with ideas. I need to make sure they don't talk.
I think ultimately speech is power, and I think it's seen very much in this world as a power dynamic, and therefore you have to silence speech that you don't like and maybe amplify speech that you do. It's a very significant therefore debate, and please give us your closing thoughts, so your words of wisdom as to where you think we're going and what we need to do about it as a society and where we need to stand.
One of the things that's worth recognizing is that there's a difference between what the ordinary South African believes and what you see in the press or what you see from political elites. That I think ordinary South Africans recognize that we live in a very multicultural society with a variety of beliefs, and that they think that this is a virtue. That if you look at the Institute for Race Relations polling data, people recognize that they need other races to prosper. I went to a school which had Jews, Muslims, and Christians and Hindus, and it was a wonderful environment to be in because we could all learn from each other, debate each other, be enriched by each other. That we have a lot to learn from each other, and so I think a lot of people are willing to extend that olive branch or that tolerance. But there's a point at which, when the state and the elites poke and poke and poke and try and tear apart that fabric in a society, and especially as economic conditions get worse, people then start to look for scapegoats, and they say, the real danger are these people, and we need to get them, and we need to silence them. And so it's important to be able to step back from that. I think one of the things that I say to people all the time is that no matter how bad things get, they can always get worse, and it requires us to ensure that they don't get worse. That things can get bad very quickly as well. And I think we saw that with the July riots. We saw it with violent protests in America that went on for months. That the chains that keep society together can be fragile. And so it's important that civil society organizations play this role in pushing back against state tyranny, in strengthening communities. And one of the things that is amazing about South Africa is how many wonderful NGOs there are that are willing to cooperate with each other, that are willing to foster growth and get communities to talk to each other. And I think that's how we prosper, and that's how we protect free speech and freedom of religion and really prosperity for all of us.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much for your time. We know it is precious, so we are really, really grateful. And thank you for this interview.
Yeah, much appreciated. Thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure.